Hello and welcome back. This is Paolo, your host, and this is again Conversation in Artificial Intelligence. Today we go into the realm of HR, people management, people satisfaction, how companies will keep people in their workplace. Now it's the time the AI will let companies making you happier than before. Let's see if that's possible. With me today, we have Eric Pelletier, who is the CEO of Yva.ai, a very interesting startup that is delocalized across Silicon Valley in Europe. And they're doing lots of interesting work around applying machine learning into the realm of HR analytics. Hi, Eric, how are you today?
Very good, and you, Paolo? It's a pleasure to be here.
I am very good. Thank you so much for being here. So, Eric, you have a very business intense strategy background. How did you end up in artificial intelligence?
So the story is first of all, I start with my parents. My father was a jet fighter pilot, so obsessed with machines, and my mother has a background as a philosopher. So I always add the two aspects in me, in my life, going from literature to mathematics and back, etc., etc. So I started my business life as a strategy consultant. I started at Bain, and people know Bain with the obsession about corporate performance. And this is really how I was raised from a business standpoint, focusing on performance, focusing on the tools, the approaches, the methodologies, anything that would increase corporate performance. I did that for many years until 10 years ago. I did some work. At the time, I was running the private equity practice for Oliver Wyman in London. And I did some work trying to understand why some private equity funds were overperforming traditional companies. When I did the work, I removed all the financial aspects, the tax advantage, the leverage, all these things, and then realized that what PE funds were doing very differently was the way they were managing people. And I had lots of conversation with the top funds, and then I realized that what was left today in terms of improving corporate performance, the new frontier, if you will, was HR, was people. I moved into HR. My friends thought I was completely crazy. Maybe they're right, actually, but still, I did it. And then I started building the tools that would actually help us understand how people perform and the ways that people and teams can perform better. I did that for almost 10 years, and then I realized that the tools, the computational power that was required to do that had to be artificial intelligence. And then I was fortunate, I met David Yang, and he was trying to do something with Eva, and we talked and we focused it on HR and people analytics. And our drive, our focus, my true passion is how can we increase corporate performance by helping people being more motivated, more engaged, more efficient when they work.
This is definitely very interesting. I'd like to dwell for a second on the findings that you had 10 years ago. So can you tell us a little bit more into details what you found about the return on investment from private equity that were managing people better? What managing people better mean or meant to you at that time?
Yeah, what we found when we did the analysis at the time was the following, that the large private equity funds like Blackstone, KKR, Bain Capital would overperform traditional public companies by something between 1/3 to 50%, right? That was the first finding, and that was a shock. People did not expect that. And I'm talking about performance once deflated for all leverage and financial aspect, right? So it's pure operational performance. The second thing I realized is that they were intensely focused on people, intensely. Typically, the meetings I would have with PE funds, we would talk about the strategy of the company for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And then the rest of the hour would be dedicated. What do you think about that person? Is she doing well? What do you think of this one? I heard this guy at the supplier is great. Should we talk to him? And they actually have a mental map that's really focused on people. The other thing is the way they set objectives is very different from traditional companies. At least 10 years ago was very different. It was much more driven around objective, about putting people in position to be successful, understanding what drove them, and being a lot less dependent on traditional HR practices, because they felt it didn't really work. No, they didn't work very well.
So in this, in this realm, what it is that you initially identify as a space for improvement in people management? So what are the 2 or 3 things that could be improved across the boards in the standard corporate organization of today?
So what I found is, when I started going into the HR field, I realized there was something called engagement surveys. I didn't know about them. So engagement surveys, you ask your employees questions and they tell you things. And then you have a model to understand the output. Then I realized, no, this was great. This would be like an MRI of the organization. It would be a measurement system. What I saw is actually, that was the promise, but that was not the reality, because these measures, these surveys, only happen once or twice a year. So it's very discontinuous. Now that is shocking, because if you look at all the business processes, what's been happening in recent years is a move towards being real time, being continuous. And the only thing that's not continuous in companies is HR. So that was the first thing, is how do we get systems in place that can be continuous? The second thing, which is really why AI is needed, is the complexity of human beings. So we know we're complex people. We know we're complex individuals. We know that. But think of the following. When you go onto Amazon and you buy a CD or a video, whatever, it's very constrained. You go on Amazon, you know you're going to buy, and your decision is very, very limited. And you don't interact with anybody, in essence. So it's pretty simple. Then the next level is you go on Facebook, you start interacting with friends and contacts. You can do lots of things, but it's still very limited to you post, essentially. Now, if you look at what people do in a company, first of all, they can do lots of different things. Incredible. No, they can do good things. They can do crazy things. They can jump on their seat. They can buy a company. They can talk to clients. The realm of possibility is gigantic. And the other thing is the number of social interactions they have in companies is actually huge, enormous, much bigger than in your private life, because same thing in your private life, you tend to follow routines. So you talk to your family, your friends. It's a very narrow set of people, very different in a company where you interact with lots of other employees, colleagues, suppliers, clients, etc., etc. So the level of complexity of an employee and their behavior is actually huge. Now you start combining that with the fact that you want to measure that continuously, and you can do that today because we all have a digital footprint, and actually most of people in a company have a huge digital print. They send emails, they send messages. You start gathering all this information, and then you're able to detect patterns, which is the core of what AI does. So my realization was progressively is, if we want to crack what drives people performance, if we want to stop the bullshit, that there's so much bullshit around people performance, you look at all these posts on LinkedIn, do this, do that. Actually now there are ways where you can measure stuff. You can test what works, what doesn't work, and then you can replicate it. So this is the revolution that's happening in HR today. And this revolution is driven by AI.
So there are lots of interesting elements here on how the relationship between the employee and the company can be improved. So I like to go a little bit into some of the details. So you're saying that to begin with, we want to monitor real time what's happening on the people management side, on the people analytics. But what is, if we are in a telecom company and we're monitoring real time all the phone calls, benefits are evident. So basically, we're gonna see how much flow we have. We're gonna see if there is too much load. We're gonna see if there is some problem. And so it's evident why we need to monitor real time. I'd like to understand why monitor real time is a natural benefit in the realm of people analytics.
Well, first of all, as you said, the benefit of real time is evident. You have an Italian name, you probably know about Ferrari and what they do in Formula One. With the progress of the telemetry in 20 years is amazing. Now you look at the amount of data that's exchanged in real time between the car and the pit, it's just gigantic. So of course we need to do the same thing in companies. And if you start looking at the digital footprint of employees, you have access to tremendous amounts of information. The second thing is, if you have a model that allows you to understand the behavior of people, and more importantly, to predict their future behavior, now you have something that becomes very interesting. So, for instance, what we've been doing is actually we've been focusing on resignation. And we said, if we understand resignation, then we understand a lot of good things, a lot of bad things about what makes employee happy, not happy, efficient, not efficient. How do we do that? And this is when AI really comes to the party. We look at historical data, communication data, and we understand the patterns of people, the way they've been communicating over time. And we look out of these people, when I say we, it's the machine, the AI brain, looks at the patterns of those who have quit and those who have stayed. And actually, this is when the magic works. You actually see the very clear patterns about people when they decide to quit and the process of resignation, and it is a process, to the day they eventually tell you they're leaving the company. And we can compare that to other employees. So out of that, you detect a series of signals that you can use in the future to predict additional resignations in your company. Resignation is very interesting because why do people quit? We actually know the reasons why people quit. It's very simple. Half of the time it's about the boss. It's a bad boss, right? Other reason, it's people feel not recognized enough. They don't have a big, they don't have a parking space, or they don't have a corner office, or they feel their work is not looked at in the right way, or they feel they're being underpaid, or they're not being paid fairly. The reasons are standard. What's interesting is understanding why that specific person is resigning and what that tells me about the state of my organization in that division, in that department. So not only it allows us to understand why people resign, but it also, as a manager, it gives you information about the potential pathologies, what's wrong in your company.
So this is, not only it's very interesting, but it's also has a number of ramifications. So let's look at a couple of ramifications. One is, if we're able to kind of predict when people are resigning, what can we do about it? Because it might be an irreversible decision. What can company actually do, and how artificial intelligence can help them besides, if any, besides predicting?
So that's a very, very good question. First thing is actually when you tell the CHRO, head of HR or a CEO, you tell them, well, I can't, because this person wants to resign. Usually their first question is that good news or bad news? Some people you actually want to resign. It's cleaning up your organization. But the fact is, a lot of the people who resign, the people you lose, these are the people that find it easy to find different jobs or with different companies. It tends to suggest they're critical to you. And if they're critical to you, they're probably critical to your competition. We're using the same skills. So first thing is, it's cool when you have an indication, an early warning system that tells you in advance that someone is likely to resign. And depending on how early you get the signal, then you may have some impact. What do we know about resignation? We know, now we've been running lots of things. So we know 90% of cases people decide during the holiday. So my personal interpretation, they go by the swimming pool, they drink mojitos, and at the end of the day, they say, I hate my job, I want to get something else. That's the process. 90% of people decide to resign over the holidays. Then they come back.
That's interesting, by the way, very interesting.
When they come back, and then they start the process. So how do you start the process? Well, you go on LinkedIn, you start looking, then you change your picture on LinkedIn, and then you start calling friends and relationships, and you get your get outside in the marketplace. You talk to people. That's what you do. As you do all this, your patterns, obviously your internal communication patterns, are changing. They're not changing for the human eye, but the machine detects those changes. Now comes a time where, when the decision of resigning is so crystallized, you can't do anything about it. It's too late. Typically when someone comes to you and say, I quit, it's way too late. People try to say, yeah, but I'll increase your salary by 20, 30%. Very often it makes people even angrier, because they said, well, you should have done that a year ago when I told you. You did not. You told me you had no money. And now I tell you I'm quitting, and now suddenly, miraculously, you find 30%. It's even worse. So if you have we know that you need to know in advance. You need to get a sense of the reason. Is that a bad boss or a bad compensation? And then you're able to play with it. You're able to change the factors and hopefully keep the person, if that person is important to you and to your company.
So I think this is a very crucial point. So basically what we're saying here is that the decision to leave is a process, and there is a point of reversibility, the irreversibility, yes, that from the moment on, there's nothing to do anymore. So if in a way the last minute offer that we get when resign arrives before the point of irreversibility, there is a fair chance that people will stay on the job. So this is, if you like, it's like predictive medicine or preventive medicine, basically, for HR. It's prevention instead of curing.
Yeah. So the cure works better on phase 1 cancer than on phase 4, obviously. That's the same thing. And it's important because resignation, unwanted attrition, is a pathology. It is a corporate pathology, in the sense that it's bad for the company. You lose precious assets. It's also bad for the person. I don't know if you have ever been in a position where you change job and you resign. It's painful. It's traumatic, especially if you change because you're not happy. The trauma it represents is significant. So if we can avoid this trauma, this is good for the company, good for the employees.
Yeah, so I think everybody has had some situations like that, and I believe I like to look at it the other angle here. It's not only the employee leaving, but Yva.ai provides HR with an additional information that, as far as I can understand, which is basically what's happening in that division, what's happening in that place. Is there something that's going wrong? Is there a dynamic that needs to be changed? Often the dynamic depends on the manager. I think everybody has worked with the manager. So how really can company, or this collaboration between, if you like, the AI engine and new HR policies can do something about bad managers? Because sometimes bad managers are pretty high up in the hierarchy, so there is not much.
That's very important, and to me, it's one of the reasons I'm doing this on a personal basis. I think toxic managers, abusive managers are really destroying people. They're destroying value. They're bad. Now, the problem is the following, is that when you go talk to a company, And I was a strategy consultant, so I spent all my time, all my life talking to people at various levels of company. People below know the toxic managers. They know them. They can give you the list. People above, they don't. Now, why is that? Because if you look at the characteristic of toxic manager, usually they're very different in the way they talk to their bosses than the way they talk to their subordinates. They are two faces. That's one thing. The second thing is these are people that are usually very well integrated in the company, because if they were able to have those behaviors and yet move forward, it means they're doing some stuff very well. They're usually culturally very well integrated. They're very friendly with the upper realms of the company. So they're very well installed. So it's difficult to go after them because you need an objective set of data to be able to do that. So what the machine does, it actually identifies those toxic managers. And actually we've developed ways where we understand a person is toxic. Now, how is that possible? It's possible for three reasons. One, it's because those people, the way they communicate is different. And as I said, the way they communicate up and down is different. And the machine detects that. That's the first thing. The second thing is they create a bad environment. So when we do the surveys, the real-time monitoring, we see that the environment is bad. And how do we know it's bad? Because we compare it to other places in the company. So we see that this place is depressed and this one is not depressed. And then the third thing is, this is once again an application of resignation. We look at the resignation risk of the people around these toxic managers, and same thing, we see these risks are much higher. So that gives you a sense, you're not sure it's a toxic manager, but with this, it's like medicine, you get lots of information that would suggest there is an issue about that person. And that's very important because everybody who's been working in a company knows the impact of a bad boss. I mean, it's horrible for everybody involved.
So the bad managers are on the alert then. Now there is basically a watchdog behind them. It remains to be seen if companies can do anything about this, because not only usually these people are integrated, but also the ones that are perceived like the ones that bring lots of value. In my personal experience, what I've seen is sometimes these people bring some value, but other people in their position would bring the same amount of value. But they also destroy some long-term value. And the problem is nobody can measure the long-term value. Nobody can see the disruptions.
Can the company act on that? Yes. Question is more, will the company act on that? And you take the Me Too example, because I think it's Me Too is somewhat similar, toxic bosses in entertainment and other environments. Yeah, you see that some producer is very powerful, very successful, but at some stage the abuse is such that it's not acceptable anymore. What we see in companies, those toxic managers tend to be very successful, tend to be very integrated. And the only way you can remove them is to start documenting the fact that they're creating issues. And this is why it's important, and this is why it needs to be objective. What I believe we'll be seeing, you see that in Silicon Valley, you see that in other places, people are beginning to realize that abuse, bullying is not acceptable anymore. Companies will have to set up systems, compliance systems, to make sure they're tracking that. And once they're tracking, making sure they act upon these information. But that's 10 years ahead. But the path begins now. And now we have the tools that enable us to do that.
So Eric, this is not only very interesting, but it's also, I think, something that points at how the relationship between people within the work environment is going to be modified by the presence of artificial intelligence, and more broadly, how the machine and the man will work differently in the future. I'd like to take your, broader view on this. Like, what's going to be the relationship between human beings and machines in the workplace, in your opinion?
To me, it's not. Well, people say it's a big revolution. There is a revolution from the math and the technology that's applied, and that's really a revolution. And the previous revolution was data processing, essentially. So it's the next stage of the information age. At the end of the day, it's still enabling technology. The example I like to quote is, now AI proofreads contracts more accurately than lawyers. We've all worked with lawyers, so we know why. But the fact is, the accuracy rate of the machine is 90%, and it's much better than even experienced lawyers. Will lawyers disappear? No, unfortunately, no. They will still be there. They will be doing different things. So it's just, once again, to me, the drive of technology, it's always the same. You take some task, those tasks can be defined as being repetitive, and they're progressively given or handed over to the machine. AI changes the game in the sense that it the ability to do repetitive tasks has actually improved probably 100 times. So we all know proofreading a contract, that's always the same thing. When you do it, you go through the same process. It was very difficult to do before automatically because of the sheer complexity of dealing with human language. But now AI can do it very quickly. So my impression, my feeling is that AI is enabling technology, will allow us to actually start building the world differently and build the world around people. Now, let me explain what I mean by that, taking our example, Yva. If you think about HR, the way HR has been built over time is around the organizational charts. So you have an org chart, and you know that person reports to that person, and this and this. And actually, if you think about all the HR processes, they have been built around the organizational charts. Your job descriptions, your compensation, your promotion path, all these things. We also know that organization charts are not a good map of companies anymore. They describe something that is not a reality. People have, 70% of people in the US have at least 2 bosses. You work on different projects over the year. How is your performance tracked? All these things. So what we're doing with Yva, and this we can do only because we have AI, we are rebuilding the organization as the machine detects the organization around each person. What that means concretely, it takes you, Paolo, it looks at your contacts, what we call the top contacts, and it understands the organization from your perspective. So instead of having one big organization, you got, for each employee, the organization, the way that person actually interacts with the organization. Now, this is incredibly powerful, because with this, you went from a world where, there's essentially no customization in HR, and you go to a world where it's completely personalized. And this is one of the things where it will be the most personalized. It will be even more personalized than marketing today. The same thing, marketing today, understanding that, if you look at articles about Ferrari, yeah, they send you an ad about Ferrari and Porsche. Fine, that's not super smart, but it's the beginning of being individualized. What we'll be able to do, AI apply to HR, is actually be completely individualized, and that's essential. Why? Because we see that with the millennials, with all the movements of liberation of people for the past 60, 70 years, people come whole to the office, meaning that they come as they are. They don't want to dress up, physically, with a suit, but also mentally. They want to be able to come with their own personality and apply their best personality to their work. To be able to do that, you need to be able to understand the organization as centered around the person.
This is, not only is it interesting, but it opens up several more questions. As our time, comes towards an end, I'd like to bring about one particular one that comes to my mind, which is pretty in vogue here in the United States, in Silicon Valley. It's the topic of AI biases. So what you're describing is all very fascinating and illustrates a way that the machine can help building a better working environment. On the other end, when we look into things like performance reviews, determining somebody is a good manager, bad manager, these are all like crucial things, like deciding whether to give a mortgage to a person or not, deciding if somebody is guilty or not, or made a mistake or not. This is crucial. And now it's been proven that at this point in time, AI is highly sensitive to the way that it was trained, basically. And so some bias can be introduced into it. That's one problem. The other problem is that, and I see this a lot here in the United States, perhaps less in Europe, is that here people adopt technology pretty fast and let technologies define what is right and bad. And like there is a good portion of the population that says, okay, if the score is this, then its credit score is this, then the guy's bad. Or so it's like the human part is taken away. So when you look at the combination of these two things, there could be cases where a poor, innocent manager, if you like, is going to be crucified because of a machine error. So how do we go about that, and what is your take?
So bias is a huge question, and it's bias and impact, and it's also the case in Europe, because the GDPR, actually they want to make sure there's no what they call impact, which is the same thing than bias. How do we go about this? First thing is we do not pretend to understand human behavior. To me, it's still a black box. It's still very mysterious. What the machine can do is detect patterns. Okay, so if this is the pattern of someone who's about to resign historically, we apply that pattern going forward, and you can make that prediction. So that's one thing. So in that case, and we don't use personal data. We don't use gender, ethnicity, or zip code, whatever. We don't use that. We just look at the pattern of communication. Now, maybe the machine will identify, it may happen, populations that are less successful than others, but it's not the way we do it, as we have no personal data. There's nothing that would suggest we introduce a bias. That's the first thing. The second thing is the machine doesn't decide, and we're not building something, it's not an automated decision-making machine. The machine provides you with the information, and still there is human control. And that's very, very important, because what we do, we actually, people spend more time at work than doing anything else in their lives, bar sleeping. This is very important. So we have to be very careful, very prudent. So we've built some ethical guidelines so that there's no way this will be automated, and this creates automatic situation. Resignation. Resignation is, again, taking that example, this is a highly political information. If you're a manager and you have the resignation data of your people, you know something that you wouldn't know otherwise. So the question is, does it make sense to equip a manager with that information? Should that information just be restricted to HR? And what should they do with it? How do they steer the company out of that? But then you go into standard, information theory. It's just the more information you have, the more you can behave well or misbehave, depending on you, depending on circumstances. So once again, in what we do and the type of outcome we look at, the notion of bias should not be emergent. It should actually be the opposite. Because suppose you have a toxic manager, and that toxic manager is abusive. That happens. That's a lot of the toxicity is about abuse. Now, if you look at the psychology of abuse, a lot of the abuse has to do with stereotypes. So people will abuse certain minorities or certain handicaps or certain genders or sexual orientation, whatever, okay? So if the machine allows for that detection, actually, we hopefully are removing some bias. Machine doesn't need to know your name to look at your performance. And we know that just the name already has an impact on the perception of performance. Machine doesn't care about that. It's not data for the machine.
So we hope so. I think where I was a little bit, in general, I'm worried not about this technology specifically, but you know, you can look at the social media and so on. It's the way that then people basically take the technology as a source of truth. Like they start to have, you know, like some scores, and that score define completely an individual. Yeah. As I said, I've seen this happening less in Europe, more here in the United States. And I don't know why. It might be, you know, there's a slightly cultural difference or a higher tendency to accept technology. But it does happen, and there are lots of you know, Hollywood movies that if you like, if you look carefully, they criticize this element. You know, like think of movies like The Divergent. They're talking exactly about this, because there's these people that don't fit in anything, and then they get eliminated because the machine is saying that they don't fit. And so it's a topic that's been taken also by all.
What we're doing, we're trying to understand the organization around the person. And really, one thing I truly believe in is, actually, I'm very optimistic, but I believe most people can be very efficient at work if given the right tools and the right circumstances. And for that, you need to accept the person as who the person truly is. And if you start understanding and building the organization around each individual, which progressively we will be able to do, and this is why it's such a revolution, then I think that risk in many ways is mitigated. It's the real revolution is we'll be able to get people as who they are and do good, efficient work for companies and make them happy when they do that.
Very good. So for our audience, today we learn a very interesting new topic, if you like, and it's basically how artificial intelligence will help company and also people to improve their reciprocal relationship and basically mitigate or diminish the tendency of people to resign, because their unhappiness will be spotted earlier and companies have a chance to resolve that unhappiness, and perhaps finding ways to mitigate the effect of bad managers. So we're looking here at applications of AI where the future looks a future where the work environment is going to be more pleasant for everybody. So Eric, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our audience. And if you have any questions, please comment below. Eric, thank you again.
Thank you, Paolo. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.